Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you're listening to a weekly podcast about books and life. Not necessarily in that order. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at Facebook.com/virtualmemoriesshow, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on Spotify, YouTube, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please go to the iTunes store, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. That'll inspire Apple to promote us a little. And of course, you can also promote us by telling people about the podcast on social media or however else you publicize the things you like. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories Show and get access to exclusive content with a recurring monthly donation via Patreon. Just visit patreon.com/VMSpod and set up your level of support. You'll get new material from our patron-only blog, and you'll also get to listen to my quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet, which features extra material from our guests and is only available to supporters of the show. So visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. We're getting into the home stretch for 2018, and after this episode, there are only 5 more since I'm taking off Christmas week. And the last one of the year is going to be episode number 300, which, law of round numbers, it's the sort of thing I kind of care about. And I think I just lined up a really special guest for that one this morning. At least it's someone I've been trying to confirm for a while now, and 2 or 3 years. And he just wrote me to say he's moving to the West Coast and we better record in the next couple of weeks. So I wrote him back saying it would be an honor to have him in the number 300 slot. So sometimes things just work out. Even if you do put a lot of the legwork into it, it's nice when everything comes together. So, the thing I want to talk about is this podcast and the act of becoming. Because it strikes me that that's what this is about. That's why I so often ask guests about the changes over time, like how artists get better or worse at various aspects of their craft. I talk to people about how they became who they are, usually in the context of their work and their art. But it's about the process of becoming, about transformation. If you want to get psychological about it, I think that's because it fits my narrative that people can actually change, because without that, I am pretty much screwed. Anyway, as far as becoming goes, that brings us to this week's show. See, my guest this time around is Angela Himsel, and Angela has a memoir out this week called A River Could Be a Tree from Fig Tree Books. And it is about becoming. It is about her transformation from an apocalyptic Christian radio church in rural Indiana to observant Judaism in the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And that is quite an act of transformation. A River Could Be a Tree it's a really heartfelt book, and it tackles some serious subject matter. But Angela manages to keep a sense of humor about herself and some of the tenets of the Worldwide Church of God that her family belonged to. That is, she's not dismissive or ironic about the earlier stages of her life, even when some portions of that, are kind of absurd when you look at them from from years of perspective. She does a really respectful take on her upbringing, and the accidental ways in which she discovered herself, in which she became who she is. She's one of those there's key accidents, and it's a weird one, and we all have these things in our lives, but this is particularly odd. It was this last minute change for her junior year abroad. She'd been intending to go to Germany, see the, past generations of her family who'd come over to the Midwest generations before, and then saw a pamphlet for the overseas program in Israel, which kind of tied into the Worldwide Church of God stuff. And there she goes in the late 70s, early 80s to the Holy Land. And that process turns her into somebody else. Anyway, I enjoyed the book a whole lot. Seeing Judaism from her perspective, from the perspective of someone who came from a very distinct faith and a very distinct way of life that didn't have many Jews in it, it was really illuminating, as were her depictions of that rural Indiana upbringing I was talking about in the 60s and 70s. It's just a completely alien world to me, and she does an amazing job of evoking it and the massive, extensive family she belonged to. And as we talk about during the episode, A River Could Be a Tree is really ultimately a book about family, and she does a wonderful job of exploring those ties that bind, and we sometimes have to loosen them a little bit. Anyway, as far as caveats go, we recorded at her place in the Upper West Side. Her dogs were barking down in the basement, and it's New York, so there were occasional cop cars driving by, but that's pretty much it. And here's Angela's bio. Angela Himsel's writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Jewish Week, Forward, Lilith, and elsewhere. Her column, Anjatevka, ran on Zeek.net and won 2 American Jewish Press Association awards. Angela holds a B.A. from Indiana University, which included 2 years at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and an MFA from the City College of New York. She grew up the 7th of 11 children in rural southern Indiana in a fundamentalist doomsday Christian faith. She converted to Judaism and lives in New York City. A River Could Be a Tree traces that journey. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Angela Himsel. Where'd the memoir begin for you? Where'd the desire to do a full-length book? You've done columns that touch on some of the issues in your past.
I actually did not want to write a memoir. That's actually the truth. I wanted to, and I always have written fiction. I am kind of averse, actually, to writing about myself, except for in small doses, little 2 or 3 pages of prose in which I can get in and out. I didn't really want to go all in, which I knew you have to do with a memoir. You really have to be willing to kind of bare your soul. You have to be willing to share your feelings. Since I didn't really know what my feelings were, I would have to work on that one. And so I wasn't really looking to write a memoir. But several people had said, after I'd written some of my essays about growing up in the Worldwide Church of God, in this kind of kooky Christian sect, and then I converted to Judaism, several people had said, oh, maybe you want to write a memoir, but I really didn't. Then I thought, you know what? Why not? It'll be easy. But it was not easy at all. I thought it would be. I kind of thought that I knew everything because I figured I know what happened. I know myself. I know my family. But as I was writing it, it turned out that I really didn't. So there were many, many moments in which I kind of wanted to give up and just say, it's fine. Nobody needs to know this. And for whatever reason, I persevered. Mm-hmm. In answer to your question, I decided to write the memoir because I thought it was going to be easy and it would be a quickie, a 1-year project. It was not.
How long did it take?
14 years.
Okay.
Honestly, it did. I wasn't working on it the entire time.
I would hope not.
For 4. I can't stand myself for that long. For 14 years, I was not working on it for 14 years continuously. I worked on it. I put it down. I had kid stuff, bar mitzvahs, bat mitzvahs. And then I was working on other things at the same time. Then I would go back to it kind of with a fresh eye, or so I thought. Then I would have to share my feelings, so I would back off for a while. Then I would go back to it. So all in, from beginning to end, it was close to 14 years.
Was there you weren't ready for it period? Was there a sense of having to get more distance, I suppose?
Yes. I think that getting distance was really important because I remember working on different sections, and I would give them to my writing group. And my writing group would say, Angie, I really like this chapter. It's great. It's funny and it's smart, but I don't know where you are in it. And I'm like, me? I didn't want to be in that chapter. And then I realized, it's a memoir. I got to put myself in it. So it was really hard for me to put myself in my own story, to be honest. And I think that has to do with the story itself, that it was hard to write about myself, but it was hard to write about this particular story in certain sections, not in all sections. Yeah.
And being one of
10/11
children as the story develops.
Exactly.
How much of that is also the not wanting to talk too much about yourself?
It's a lot, I'm sure. I'm in the middle. So
you're number 7, right?
I'm number 7 of 11. And I thought about this as I was writing the memoir. I really never thought about your position in birth order. I really didn't. I just figured I was kind of a middle child, but middle meaning between 3 and 8. And I thought, that's kind of typical. You're kind of ignored, and, that's kind of okay. But I think that writing the memoir, I couldn't be ignored any longer. I had to really come forward and kind of stand out. And that was not a comfortable position for me, to be honest.
How much did your family in Indiana either help with the process of, not process of writing it, but at least, helping fill in some of the blanks and stories you were trying to tell? And how do they react to a finished book
Thanks
about
for asking.
this?
So when I was writing, actually, that was one of my big things, which was I thought that I knew everything basically about my family, and I knew a lot, but
we never know.
We never know. And so I called my mother one day, this is years ago, I don't know, 5, 6 years ago, and I said, and I had written down as a good journalist, which I really considered myself more than anything at that time, I had written down just pages of questions for her. What was your father's first job? What was your favorite class in school? What was your favorite moment and when you were working? And I was so surprised that she was so willing to answer the questions. And it made me realize kind of that people want to be seen. They want to be heard. They want their stories to be told. And I was so happy that she wanted to share that with me, not just for the book, because, I didn't use all of it, but I was happy that personally she wanted to share that with me. She was very gracious about it. In the book, I talk about how she remembers her Uncle Lawrence going out at night during World War II and shouting up at the sky, "Hi ho, Hitler." And I said to her at the time during the interview, I said, "Mama, I think he meant Heil Hitler." And she said, maybe he did. And that was part of the interview process. She had never told me that story before. She had never told me that she'd worked at a cannery and the highlight of her days was getting a nickel Coke with boys, and girls jumping into the car and going out to get a nickel Coke. All of that was from the process of interviewing. And I also interviewed my dad's sister, my Aunt Viola, who's a very private, lovely woman, but I never really had a one-on-one personal conversation. Who interviews their aunt, So I called her one day, and I figured the worst that can happen is that she just says, I really don't want to talk about that. So I called her, and I asked her about her father, my grandfather, who died way too early in a hit-and-run accident. And she shared with me that she'd had a dream that night, and he'd come to her and said, "I'm okay." And these were all things that came about from the process of writing the book. So I felt very grateful to have that information, that family information, some of which did not go into the book because it really wasn't relevant. But I asked a lot of questions.
Again, better that than
Yes.
people always ask, so are you going to run this whole thing, Gil? I'm like, yeah, trust me, no one's going to notice it. It's okay.
Please don't.
I did have, actually, the guest the week before you has got a section. He's like, can we cut this whole 20-minute segment out? This is going to be misunderstood really badly. I'm like, no problem.
Right.
We'll take care of it. Had there been a point where you thought of abandoning memoir and trying to fashion this as fiction?
Actually, I did the opposite. I had fashioned it as fiction, and then somebody had said maybe it should be a memoir, but I said, no, I do not want this to be a memoir. I much prefer to hide behind fiction. So I had written it as fiction. I think that in the end, sometimes your writing becomes what it wants to be, despite yourself. So I think that part of the reason it took me this long was because I was kind of kicking and screaming against the format itself. The fact that it was nonfiction was wonderful in some sense because you can really be yourself, you can really share, you can really tell the truth. But that's exactly why it was also really scary.
Sure. Now, were there memoir models and authors you sort of considered as influences? Or alternately, memoirs that you said, wow, I really don't want to write a book like that?
Actually, there's both. I loved and do still love Anne Lamott. I think that she makes herself vulnerable, but she's funny, and she doesn't throw anybody under the bus. So there was never a point during this in which I would ever have thrown anybody under the bus. Not that there was actually a couple of people I could have, but I didn't.
Always an opportunity.
But I didn't. So yes. So I liked the fact that Anne Lamott approaches her writing with integrity, and she approaches it with looking for a greater truth, not just the truth of what actually happened, but a bigger truth of humanity and what this meant and how we're connected and so on. There are some memoirs that I feel might be trying to settle scores. There was no score to settle in my mind. It was really about how you become the person you become and how you can choose to become the person you become despite everything. Sometimes you can and sometimes you can't. And so I kind of came to that mid to late way in the memoir. I wouldn't say that's how I started with it, but mid to late way, that was kind of my understanding that this is really about, the possibilities in life, but notwithstanding that there are real limitations in life as well.
Was that part of the act of becoming? That realization that the memoir itself, coming to terms with the memoir and what it told you about yourself? Did that help you define yourself in certain ways?
It probably did. I think that in a way it did make me at least crystallize that notion that as much as we have free will, and I do believe in free will, we still are a product of so many, many different influences and factors, and you can never negate those. You can maybe deal with them a bit, but you can't negate them.
Who's the audience for this book?
I would hope that it's a general audience, because I guess that even though there are a number of different niche audiences, I do think ultimately it's a memoir about family. And we all have a family, whatever kind of family that is. I was
going to say like it or not.
Whatever kind of family. We've got a small family, we've got a big family, we've got a family that doesn't get along, we've got a family that's very, very close and has to go on family vacations. But we all have a family of some sort, if you're lucky, or maybe not, but we have a family. And I felt that in the end, even though that wasn't actually, again, the purpose in writing it, I really realized, wow, I come from a family, hundreds of years ago. I've created a family of my own, and I wanted to express this notion of family. People change. My parents changed their faith. I changed my faith. People are very different within one's family. We all know that. But there is still this notion of family. So I would hope that basically anybody who has a family might find it intriguing, like, oh, this is how this family works. That's interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was wondering if you felt it was more for Jewish audiences, more for Gentile audience, but it does, to me, it like your life spans both parties, as it were.
I hope so. Thanks.
Weirdest aspect of Judaism you encountered?
The weirdest aspect of Judaism?
Yeah, the thing that struck you as weirdest. And there are a few moments in the book.
The one that really struck me as the weirdest was honestly the public bris.
I assume that was going to be it.
Honestly, I mean, really, everybody wants to come and publicly look at a baby penis. I mean, really?
I've attended two, but only one that I remember. So, yeah.
Got it.
But yeah, no, I burst out laughing at that segment of the book, and my wife's like, "What's so funny?" I'm like, "I'll explain it to you after, but trust me, it's good."
Right.
But yeah, the notion of especially while you're in the hospital bed and your husband's trying to arrange.
Right.
Yeah.
Lox and cream cheese.
And sable.
Exactly. And sable. Who knew?
Weirdest aspect of the Worldwide Church of God that you've had to explain to people?
Oh, God, there's so many.
Oh, I know. And those are ones that I laughed over, too.
Right.
Quite a bit.
The Worldwide Church of God had so many weird aspects, but maybe the weirdest one was that they believed that they knew when we were going to be raptured and where we were going to be raptured. We were going to be raptured in 1975. We were going to be raptured to Petra in Jordan. And they would later say they never actually decided upon that, but I have literature from them to prove that they actually did say that in reality, and we believed it. And there were people who were looking forward to the rapture and Jesus returning.
Yeah. Did you ever get to Petra?
I was in Petra.
Yeah, I couldn't remember. You've been.
No, I
it's not in the book.
I don't think I mentioned it.
No.
But 11 years ago, I was in Israel for a bar mitzvah with my family, and part of the bar mitzvah thing was to go to Petra. So we went to Petra, and in the church, Petra was described as a place of safety, which is a phrase from the book of Revelations, that you will be taken to a place of safety when Jesus returns. Mm-hmm. So I made a sign that said place of safety, and I held it up, and I made my daughter take a photo of me, and I sent it to all of my siblings, and we all had a very big laugh about it.
You do have the great moment where you and a couple of siblings prank one of the other ones with while she's in the bathroom, leaving a note saying,
yes.
We've been raptured.
Yes, exactly. We still do. Yeah. The joke never tires.
I assume that's one of those standards you're going to fall back on
exactly.
all the time. Upper West Side misconceptions about the Midwest. You come from Southern Indiana,
right.
Particularly, farming sort of rural world. Are there aspects in your day-to-day life here where people kind of have a perception of what life is like that does not jibe with what you went through?
I think that
how much of a cocoon do people here live in, I guess, is the
people on the Upper West Side, and also Jews in general, I think, live in a cocoon. And by that I mean that I think there are many Jews who feel that those in Southern Indiana have a preconceived notion of Jews, but they're not thinking about them at all. People in Southern Indiana are not thinking about Jews, and they're not thinking about Albanians. They're not thinking about Russians particularly. Maybe a little bit more than Jews, but not really. They're honestly just thinking about finding a parking spot in Kmart. That's what they're thinking about. So they don't have any preconceived notions of the other because they are landlocked. They don't like the Kentuckians.
Of course.
But aside from that, they don't really think about the Upper West Side. And I think that people on the Upper West Side are a bit full of themselves, and they think that people are thinking about them, but they're not. Mm-hmm. That's what I would say.
Yeah. First Jew you ever met?
Well, the first Jew I ever met, actually, I don't remember if I mentioned this in the book, but there was a Jewish family in Jasper, Indiana.
I don't remember that coming out.
Right.
Okay.
There was a Jewish family, but I never thought about it because I sort of knew them but didn't know them. Nobody was in my class. And I'd met them and I knew them and I knew that they were Jewish. But the word Jewish to me had no meaning. So if you'd said that you were Finnish, I'd be like, fine, so you're Finnish, good. Mm-hmm. But I never had any thought about what it meant to be Jewish. So I met them and I knew it, but I didn't really know it.
I shudder to ask, only because I encountered this sort of situation with a seminarian from North Dakota once. The only Jew in my town, he said, was the town doctor, lawyer, and an accountant. I was like, really? That's every stereotype in one? So is this one Jewish family, fit every one of those professions?
Jeweler.
Yep. Okay. I assume that's how we ended up there. That's our thing.
Yeah.
But that's, I get the same thing. I'm married to a Cajun Mennonite, so
wow.
She's not a Mennonite. Some of her family members are.
Okay.
But I go down to rural Louisiana, and it's not a novelty thing. They're perfectly accepting, but it's just one of the
Sure.
Yeah. There are a lot of Jews over in Metairie by the big hospital, and a couple of the areas near New Orleans, but out in the bayou, not so much.
Right.
So
it's funny.
Are there things that your family now and your Jewish world can't believe you ate back in your childhood and your Indiana days?
So we kept kosher.
No, I mean, yeah, it's true.
Right.
Yeah,
so we didn't eat the squirrels and the frog legs and the turtle soup that my family was eating.
They eat squirrels in my town, 25 miles from the city, by the way. Just
yeah, well, it's supposed to taste like, I've never had squirrel in my life. I've never had frog legs in my life. I've never had turtle soup in my life. My brother is an avid hunter, and he does eat those things. But we grew up not eating non-kosher food. So we did not eat pork, and we did not eat shellfish, and we didn't eat all that stuff.
I suppose for the edification of the listeners, you should explain how the Worldwide Church of God quite differed from other Christian sects. I could mention it in the intro, but I think it's going to be more entertaining from you.
Okay, so the Worldwide Church of God believed that since Jesus was Jewish, we were supposed to abide by the Jewish laws. And so unlike other Christian sects, we believed that we were not supposed to observe the Christian holidays like Christmas and Easter and Valentine's Day. They were based in paganism. And we were supposed to observe the Jewish holidays, so Passover, Feast of Tabernacles, Yom Kippur, and so on. And we also, Jesus didn't eat non-kosher food, so we didn't eat non-kosher food. And we observed the Sabbath on Saturday as well. Mm-hmm. We were the only ones in town who did this.
Yeah, and that's another aspect of having one Jewish family in your town and one Worldwide Church of God worshiping family as opposed to the Lutherans and the Catholics.
Exactly. People did not know, by the way, that we were different. We knew we were different, but this was not something we advertised. And actually, I was talking to my sister about it the other day, and we both said, we never told our friends. And it's kind of sad that you have this sense of shame about something that you're doing because you don't want to feel different or feel other than even your friends. And it sort of says something. Did you think that your friends would reject you or would
children are monsters?
Children are awful and monsters, but I think that we were wrong. I think our friends would have been like, okay, cool. And maybe people would do that now. But back then, it was just too much. It was too much. So we had all of these friendships, and we had very different worlds that we lived in. We lived in the world in Jasper with our Catholic and Lutheran families, and then we lived in this Worldwide Church of God world, and the two did not meet.
Were there witnesses or any other weird offshoots in your? Like, I'm wondering, did you guys have any sort of Pledge of Allegiance issues or anything like that would have made you stand out in school? Or we
did do the Pledge of Allegiance, but it was very uncomfortable when it came to choir, because I was in choir and we had to sing all of the Christian songs, all of the Christmas songs. So was I supposed to actually sing, or should I mouth the words? And God would know I'm not singing. So I never knew quite what to do, quite frankly. So it was it was a very inconsistent way, I guess, of practicing my faith. How much can you practice your faith and still live in, the world, as the church would refer to it?
It puts me in mind of growing up in northern New Jersey, I think grade school Christmas pageant or holiday pageant, which even then we called it back in the 70s. Mm-hmm. And they had some song with Christ in it. And my mother and the other 4 Jewish mothers in town went ballistic.
Right.
And it led to a big kerfluffle with Mrs. Purdy, the music teacher, that, she thought it was perfectly fine and innocent until the Jewish moms got involved, and then it got ugly.
Well, not to be political, but actually it should not be in public schools.
Oh, yeah.
To be honest.
That was where they were coming from.
It's wrong for it to be in public schools, and it should not be a part of public schools because it just shouldn't.
Yeah. And again, as an 8 or 9-year-old, we knew nothing.
Right.
We had no conception of this, and then we just saw our parents are very mad right now. That was,
right.
How things went. How did Israel change for you? You first went there early 80s.
81, right?
And you've gone for decades since.
Yeah, I go a lot. I love Israel.
Yeah.
It's a complicated place, and we're not going to get into its politics, but despite all of everything anybody may ever say about Israel, I really love Israel. And I don't know, it has a spirituality to me that I don't find other places, and it just makes me happy. It's my happy place.
In the sense of the literal historical resonance of it, or?
The literal historical resonance of it, correct. I think that, look, if I'd thought that, the prophets had been wandering around at the Grand Canyon, I might feel that way about the Grand Canyon, but I don't. So it's not that Israel is so magnificently beautiful. It doesn't have the fjords. It doesn't have what you might think is going to be stunningly beautiful geography. But I do feel this sense that just permeates it, of the ancientness of it, that people have lived here and found, some connection, I guess, to something higher than themselves, whatever that is.
Many of your siblings traveled there?
They have. When I was in Israel, and I didn't include this in the book because it was just too difficult, but my sister Liz came to visit me for a couple of weeks when I lived in Israel. And my sister Sarah, because I really enjoyed Israel, she ended up doing the same one-year program in her junior year abroad, also in Israel.
But she didn't convert?
Nobody
or
else
adopted
did.
Judaism?
No, not at all. Nope.
And what was the toughest part for you? I don't mean in terms of the education, but the sense of becoming a Jew.
Of becoming a Jew? What was the toughest part?
Yeah. And I know it's the core of what you're wrestling with in the book, but...
Right. I think that the toughest part about becoming a Jew was deciding to become a Jew. Once I decided, it was like, fine, whatever. I'm like a smart student. I can pass all these tests. No problem. Just ask me the blessing for the lulav and I will give it to you. But I think the toughest part was making the decision and saying, I'm just going to leave the past behind. It's really not working. And I haven't been doing this for such a long time. Who am I kidding? So that was probably the toughest part, was making the decision to let go of the past. Mm-hmm. Once I'd made that decision, it was fine.
You characterize yourself in those years as someone who's very black and white, someone who wants to very much, have a correct path,
right.
etc. Moving into a religion that's much more about argument, ambivalence, and ambiguity.
Yes.
How much of that, how difficult was that for you in terms of, none of these people are the authority?
I know. I think that I still do struggle with that. There is a tension there because on one hand, I love it. Because it's exactly what I was missing in my religion, which was, isn't there room for discussion? Isn't there room for another point of view? On the other hand, when I hear all these points of view, I kind of want to shake everybody. It's like, you know what? Just make up your mind. Either or, I don't care, but just give me one answer. So I guess I still have a tension between the two of those, but I still prefer to have more options.
You talk about writing and the influences you've had over the years. I mean, you mentioned a little bit of Anne Lamott, but both in fiction and nonfiction, who are the other writers, A, who sort of helped guide you early on, and B, who you're currently...
So I never heard of Philip Roth until I was in Israel. And my friend James actually said, Angie, you have to read Philip Roth. I said, okay, fine, I'll read it. And I was like shocked, horrified, couldn't believe it, couldn't put the book down. It was Portnoy's complaint.
I was assuming. And I have a story about that I'll tell you off mic. But.
Okay. I loved it. And I think part of the reason I loved it was because it was fiction. And growing up in the church, I sort of thought fiction was lies, and one wasn't supposed to lie. So even though I read fiction, it was with a certain amount of guilt. But so he was writing fiction, and he was writing these outrageous things. And I was just intrigued and shocked and excited and judgmental. So I think that Philip Roth had a huge effect on me because he was funny and he was willing to just go there. I always liked poetry, even though I'm not a good poet, but I thought I was.
I was glad you included an example of your
so
crappy
bad.
poetry in
so
the
bad.
books.
I know. I did not want to include any of my poetry, and my editor asked me, and I actually found it, and I was like, oh, God, please just cut it down to like one stanza.
It illustrated the point very well.
Thank you. But the person who I really loved was Rainer Maria Rilke. I just did. And I loved Letters to a Young Poet. I thought that was just a beautiful, generous book of a poet sort of sharing. And I don't know why that just popped into my head just now, but I really liked him for really a long time. I guess that I always liked 19th century literature. Not really sure why, but I think that it was pre-Victorian era, and they could be naughty and bawdy at the same time. So there was a lot of 19th century literature that I always liked. I love, what's his name? Jeeves.
Oh, Wodehouse.
Wodehouse.
Yeah.
Love P.G. Wodehouse. I went through a Wodehouse period where I basically didn't surface for months and was just laughing myself hysterical for months. So I think that I probably like humor and I like intelligence in writing. I don't like anything depressing. I don't like anything where a child dies, despite my own writing. And I like something that sort of is going to give me something to take away, just a tiny bit of a philosophical nugget of some sort.
And when it came to writing columns, was there a template or a writer that you emulated for those things when you're doing the short pieces? Or was it just like me, you kind of knock something out and think, I think this is a column? I'm not 100% sure.
I think that I just knocked it out, but I probably was unconsciously influenced by other people. And I think one of the people I always loved as a columnist was Nora Ephron. And I also loved the woman who wrote Life Isn't a Bowl of Cherries.
Irma Bombeck.
Irma
I have not thought of that woman in 25 years. I'm so glad that came right to mind.
I loved Irma Bombeck. And by the way, I never knew she was Jewish until like way late in life. It just didn't occur to me. So it's interesting that they are both Jewish women that I am mentioning.
Well, listen, I'm going to go back to near the beginning of the book. You have a segment where you say the reason your family came into the Worldwide Church of God is because the literature was free.
Exactly.
And you said, my mother was incapable of turning down anything she didn't have to pay for and never left a restaurant without a packet of condiments, straws, and a fistful of half and half. Now, the idea that you weren't Jewish and yet, your mother was like that, to me, that's like my mother. That's
right.
Every Jewish mom I know was, well, it's like they're giving this away. We may as well take some.
Right.
So I think spiritually, you have some Jewish DNA.
I might have.
At that point.
That's funny.
But yeah, so there's a certain degree.
I do the same thing, by the way.
Of course.
I also take sugar packets in Sweet and Low.
We have the strategic napkin reserve in my car. Also, just grab 2 or 3 extras, put them in the little...
Just in case. I mean, the Cossacks might be coming.
And you need to wipe. And that's strategic napkin reserve. That's how we do it. Being a Jewish mother, knowing the stereotypes of what a Jewish mother is, and finding yourself as a Jewish mom, were there things you had to live up to, or, degrees of, I don't understand why every other mother in the neighborhood is acting like X. I'm still Y. So.
Well, my sister-in-law, Debbie, has said to me, Angela, you've converted in every which way except for one, food. And she's kind of right. I mean, my poor kids are very skinny. But no, not really. But I do think about food. I mean, one has to eat, but I don't think about what I'm making for Rosh Hashanah 3 weeks in advance. So when everybody else is talking about their Rosh Hashanah coming up in 3 weeks, I'm like, this is an as-needed basis, and I don't need to think about it right now. I have other things to think about. I will think about it 3 days before. That's plenty of time to get the food, find my recipes, which I'm using from last year anyway, and just get it prepared. So I do find that that's one way in which, as a Jewish mother, I was definitely not quite as hands-on when it comes to food. I'm sure that a lot of Jewish mothers are not, by the way, but it's a stereotype that they are going to make sure that you have food at all given times, whereas my kids will call home and say, is there food? Yeah. In a hopeful voice.
Should I pick something up on the way, Mom?
Exactly.
So my mother is British and Jewish, so food was always a nightmare. It was she could burn cereal, so it was terrible. So we never had that, luckily. It worked out okay.
Yes.
But adapting to having a Jewish mother-in-law and the stereotypes behind that, also everything. It doesn't seem as though that was a bad relationship.
So my mother-in-law was wonderful. Yeah. I adored her, and I hope that she adored me as well. I think she did. She was a very typical Rebbitzin, and she was very warm. People were drawn to her, and she was interested in everybody's lives, and she was genuinely interested. So I'm not sure what a typical, stereotypical Jewish mother-in-law would be. I don't know that she was, because she was just a lovely, warm, wonderful person. I never thought of it as being a Jewish mother-in-law.
Good. Okay. That's
yeah. It's true, by the way.
When you're starting with this as a native, you see everything through the prism of
right.
Us. We're recording a few days after the massacre in Pittsburgh.
Right.
As a converted Jew, how do you see anti-Semitism? As a Jew who's first generation American, my parents were 1940 London, 1938 Bucharest. We've got lots of Eastern European family. You're raised with, you should always keep one eye on the door. Right. Basically, it's always going to happen at some point. Mm-hmm. Coming to this later in your life, how do you adapt to that? Or how do you...
I think it's just scary.
Yeah.
I mean, I just think it's ultimately just scary. It's a scary world that we live in which anybody, not just Jews, but anybody who's, not white and Christian might possibly come under attack. And they have come under attack. I think that anti-Semitism is apparently up, according to, I think, the ADL in the last year, and it's very scary. I have Jewish kids. And I'm Jewish, and we could have been in that synagogue. We could have been visiting somebody. They could come to my synagogue. How is it that we are having to have armed guards in places of worship? And how would Christians feel if they had to have armed guards? How would that happen? Anyway, nobody's asking that question. But as a Jew now, facing anti-Semitism.
Yeah, I mean, have you integrated that sense of constant paranoia that we have?
No.
Okay, good.
I have not integrated the sense of constant paranoia for being a Jew, but I have integrated it just because quite frankly, being a woman, you're very paranoid.
Sure.
Because I think that men don't realize that if I walk down a dark street, I'm looking over my shoulder. So I think that I have a different sense of paranoia. And probably I'm guessing half the population has that every woman in the United States has that paranoia.
Yeah, I think that's one of the, and it's very late for men to have picked up on this, one of the, we'll say, positive aspects of the Me Too era
Correct.
that we're in is, oh my God, we have been making them feel terrible. All
Right.
these,
Yeah.
there's nothing we can necessarily do exactly, but, except try not to make you feel terrible.
Exactly.
I did have a guest who canceled because we were at a festival and she refused to come up to my hotel room.
Wow,
And I was
sad.
like, we can leave the door open. You could bring a second person. I don't
That's so sad.
care. And she's like,
Right.
yeah, I just have a policy against this. I'm like, I can't get a conference room. So I
Right.
guess we're going to have to cancel.
It's a tough thing.
I didn't want to make her feel bad
Right.
or pressured about it. I was like
Right.
trying to offer her anything that was going to make it easier.
Right.
But that's one of those, I know I'm not a bad guy, but
Right.
yeah. But yeah, as a Jew with family with World War II history, there's just that constant sense that it's always, it's like that when, and it is getting political. I'll probably end up cutting this
Right.
part. The idea that Bernie would have won instead of Hillary, my house would have been burned down.
Right.
They would have thrown rocks
Right.
through your windows.
Right.
We know that's,
Right.
they're just waiting, and it's one of those like, I know you think that's the case, but actually that anti-Semitism they applied towards her would have been a million times worse and potentially
Right.
irreparable. But yeah, that's one of the big questions I wanted to ask, though,
Sure.
because it came up in the book as part of your relationship with your siblings and your parents. One of the prophecies for your former faith, the Worldwide Church of God, was that if you're not part of the rapture, terrible things will happen. Parents will end up eating their children.
Yes.
And you go through that with your siblings trying to guess
Yes.
which one would. And trust me, I've had a variant of that in my former workplace. When I worked in an office, there was the A, who's going to snap, B, who's going to be the one person who gets out. And
Right.
But have you thought about it with your own children in terms of which one you would eat out of the three?
Oh God! Oh my God! No,
Or
I
have you
haven't.
left that faith behind that much?
I've really left it behind. I haven't even thought about it. Oh, that's funny. Kind of awful.
I was hoping, but I figured you probably had that's the old world.
That's
we don't
right.
think about that.
No,
now.
we don't think about that one.
And it was an interesting phenomenon of the book when you're describing your children's education and the way they see this world as an emanation of God, as opposed to particularly the faith you were in previously that treated this world as, a
Devil's playground.
yeah, the abyss that
Right.
we're one step away from falling into.
Yeah.
Which reminds us of the beauty of being a Jew, or at least seeing the world as this. You bring up some aspects of Kabbalah in the book in the non self-help Madonna
Right.
way.
No. Right.
Is that an aspect of the faith that you've stuck with, or just something you kind of looked at and
I've looked at it and I think about it, but I'm not practicing in any sense of the word. But I do like Kabbalah. I like the original sense of it. I like the way that it's attempted to imbue Judaism with a different meaning. I think it's tried to help it to go deeper and so that Judaism isn't laws and that sort of thing, but rather that there's a symbolic meaning to it as well.
I'll say mysticism, not in the commonplace occult way, but it's
Right.
a mystical vision in terms of that there's a knowability of God, that there's a way
Right.
of trying to reach the Godhead through,
Right.
not just through blind adherence to laws. So.
Correct.
Are we any closer to Tikkun Olam? Is that
I don't know if we're any closer to Tikkun Olam. I wish we were, but I like the fact that we at least aspire to it. We aspire to bringing the pieces that are missing and broken and bringing them together and trying to make a whole. I like that we aspire to it. In the church that I grew up in, we did not aspire to it. That was Jesus' job. So one of the big differences and one of the things I do like about Judaism is that we acknowledge and recognize that the world is kind of broken, and we know that, but we're going to at least try to fix it. We're not going to ignore it. We're not going to wait for Jesus to fix the climate crisis or any of the other ills in this world.
Mm-hmm. How's the reaction been to the book so far? You've done a couple of readings. I have.
People have really, I mean, not to pat myself on the back because I'm a very modest Midwesterner, but people have liked it, and I've been happy and pleased to see that it has appealed to both Jews and non-Jews. So I was talking to a woman who's not Jewish who read half the book, and she told me that it's the only book she's reading. She's been reading. She never reads, and that she really likes it, and it appeals to her because she never really knew that much about Jews before. And so she's discovering things about Jews, and she's also finding herself a bit just in my own quest, because she has her own personal, she grew up Methodist and she no longer practices. She's not going to become Jewish, but I think the fact, and nor should she, but I think the fact that maybe my quest might encourage or enable others to realize it. Yeah, you can quest, go right ahead. And I think that my Jewish friends have said, I didn't really know that about Christianity before. And I don't know, maybe, did you find that?
About your particular faith?
No, not about mine, but just Christianity in general.
I've learned a great deal over the last 20 years, but it's one of those things growing up.
Right.
I literally didn't know a difference between Catholics and Protestants. I was just the kid that other kids shouted Heil Hitler at on the school bus.
Oh, God.
Yeah, well, awful. that was, that's one of those things where my family did not, or my parents didn't quite know what was happening in grade school as I was a kid.
Yes.
But yeah, literally until I started to get some distance, get to college and beyond, I was like, to me, they were just all Christians. I didn't know anything about a split. And then took a while to start figuring this stuff out.
And there's no reason that you should. I mean, and I do think, honestly, in terms of, education, instead of doing all of the Christmas pageants and stuff, let's just have like a couple of classes about the difference between religions. Why not? I mean, it's an important thing to know what people believe and why they believe it. Not because you're trying to preach to them, but just it's an educational thing that we should know these things about each other, and maybe we would feel more comfortable with each other if we knew that. It would just demystify it a bit.
Yeah, I think in my case, it was further complicated by having my next door neighbors, who I still live there, and I still live next door to them, who are Baptist, and the mother has been trying to save our souls for all my 47 years. She would drop those little Jack Chick comic tracts about all the horrible things people do and end up in hell.
Oh, God.
And that's why you have to become Baptist. The joke's on her, actually, because she's now become a Jew for Jesus. She's gone into Messianic Christianity.
Right. Yeah.
And she now is showing up at my door with DVDs about the 6-Day War and God's glory in Israel. I'm like, ha, Tammy, we showed you. You came on sort of to our weird side. So,
that's very funny.
Yeah, but that was, as far as I knew, that's what Christians were like, because Tammy was always trying to foist off this particular vision on us. Yeah, it's kind of weird. But there are aspects of this that I think more the Midwestern culture that you evoke from this, particularly for the 60s and 70s, to me was really illuminating. It's just an era and a culture I knew nothing about.
Right.
And I'm trusting that you portrayed it honestly and you weren't making up terrible things about people.
I don't think I was. I actually did. Listen, it took me 14 years, so I did a lot of research.
Besides the interviews with your mom and your aunt, what was the biggest surprise as you were writing this? Like, what surprised you in the process of?
So what surprised me in the process was something that it's in the book. It's that my great aunt Margaret, my grandma's sister, she lived in Hamburg, and I went to visit in 1982. And she lived with her friend Gradle, and she'd always lived with Gradle, and we all knew that they were best friends. And one night, after we'd finished playing cards, Gradle says to me, "Angela, I love your aunt." I said, "I know, we all love her." She goes, "No, I love your aunt." I said, I know, we love her. She's great, we love her. That was kind of the end of the conversation. I never thought about it ever again. And then, I don't know, maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, I don't remember exactly when, I was thinking about that conversation and something about it. Something about it.
Yeah.
I said, I wonder, maybe she meant that like in a romantic way. Oh my God. And so that's when I called my Aunt Viola. I thought, I got to ask somebody, and I don't want to ask Daddy because he's going to be horrified by this. So I called my Aunt Viola. I said, Viola, it just occurred to me. What do you think? And she said, I thought that myself a few times. And it was really, while I was writing the book and just thinking about Aunt Margaret and her life, it just popped into my head. And obviously it's something that must have had been there, just sort of slumbering and waiting for me to kick it, to bring it back to life a little bit. And so I felt that, to a certain extent, when I was writing it, that was actually one of the biggest revelations. And it shouldn't have been a revelation, but it was, because nobody ever talked about it. My Aunt Viola had never talked about it. I mentioned it to my father, and he said, yeah, I thought about that too. And I thought, well, they've all been thinking about it, but not telling each other, nor telling me.
Midwestern Reserve.
No, not going to tell anybody. Yeah. So I felt that like writing about it and letting that surface was a real gift, because I felt that Aunt Margaret and Gradle had never had kids of their own. So this was my own way of honoring their story and letting their kind of love story be embedded within my story. Mm-hmm. So that was one of the main reasons I included it, honestly, was because it really had nothing to do with my story, quite frankly, except for it was a revelation that happened during the course of writing my story.
Could be the sort of thing you end up writing a novel about down the line.
Yeah, you never know.
Is there well, I know this one took you 14 years, but
yes.
Other project, next book?
Well, yeah, I actually have finished revising a novel, because I really don't want to write about myself anymore. I've worked on and am revising a novel called God on the Couch, in which God is in therapy. So
getting back to your Portnoy's complaint.
Yes, one of my obsessions is God and God's concern and interest in humankind. What does God want from us? So God's going into therapy to actually figure that out. And I will share that answer with you in that novel, God willing, if it is published.
As we start to figure it out.
Yeah.
Last question, and it could be weird and personal,
okay.
and just tell me if it is. You did once write a column about getting a navel piercing at 40.
I did.
Tattoos? Or is that
too painful.
Okay.
I don't do anything that's painful.
I wasn't sure if that was scripture or Torah or that. Okay.
No, I don't like anything that's permanent and painful. So I'm glad you asked, Gil. I'll answer this. I have done temporary tattooing on my eyebrows. Yes. To make them less blonde. So they cut into my eyebrows and they deposit a temporary pigment. But that's pretty much all I can do, and I only do that for vanity. Which,
again, when you write extensively about how the Worldwide Church of God banned makeup and you refuse to...
I did not want to adhere to that, and so this is my rebellion, my tattooed eyebrows, and my eyelash extensions. So there.
You showed them once and for all.
I certainly did. Now they know.
Yeah, is there any... I don't want to say blowback, but are there people who are still affiliated with the Worldwide Church? I know it's splintered off.
It's splintered off, and I am friends with people on Facebook who are also former members. And one of the persons actually messaged me and said, it sounds like an interesting book. And I said, you'll recognize a lot of it. And she wrote me a long message back and said, I have a lot of conflicting feelings about it. Because it was not
about the book or about her own experience?
No, about her own experience.
Okay. Yeah.
It was not an easy church, obviously, to grow up in. And so I think the people who left will actually like my book. They'll say, yeah, you go, girl.
But not hearing anything yet from people who are still in the church. I know the book is still just starting up. So,
right.
Okay. Just keep an eye out.
I will.
Let me know how that, how that sort of response goes.
I will.
Weirdest aspect of New York, given your Midwestern upbringing, your, relatively rural life, what weirded you out about New York, or continues to?
About New York City? Yeah. I think that this isn't what weirds me out. This is actually what makes me so happy about New York. It's weird, but it makes me happy, which is, you walk down the street and there's some homeless person, talking to himself or herself. And then, there's an opera singer here, always on the Upper West Side. There's always an opera singer who's walking down the street and doing some sort of an aria just to herself, And then there's every different type of person on the street at the same time, and they get along. And they just accept one another for all of their little weirdnesses. Walking down the street in Indiana, I can assure you, if I heard somebody singing an aria, I would be concerned. And here, I'm like, good for them. Like, they've got nothing else to do. So it's the weirdest thing about New York City. It's the most wonderful thing about New York City is that everybody can really, truly be themselves. I mean, nobody bothers you for all of your weirdnesses at all.
Do you remember first celebrity sighting?
My first celebrity. Because
when you got here, you wouldn't have had so much mass culture.
Right, but I actually don't pay attention to celebrity. Yeah. And so there was a time, I'm going to say 15, 20 years ago, because I don't remember how long ago it was, and I had dropped my kids off at school, and I went to the Starbucks on 86th and Broadway to get coffee, naturally. And then I brought it over to put sugar into it. And I was standing there, and there was a guy standing across from me. And I looked at him, and I was just waiting for him to move out of the way so I could get my sugar. And then he didn't move very fast. So I looked at him again, and I said, you look a lot like Tom Hanks. And he said, And I said, yeah, you really do. And then he finished and he left, and I put some sugar in my coffee, and I walked out the door. And about 5 blocks later, I said, I think that was Tom Hanks. So I'm very slow. If I ever met anybody who was, I wouldn't even notice it, quite frankly.
Gotcha. It certainly beats my similar Gilbert Gottfried story. I'll tell you that one some other time. But Angela, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
And that was Angela Himsel. Her brand new memoir is A River Could Be a Tree from Fig Tree Books. Just comes out this week. You can find more of Angela's writing, her book tour schedule, pictures, other columns, etc. at angelahimsel.com, which is ANGELAHIMSEL.com. Now, after we wrapped, I asked Angela, so, who are you reading? If you want to hear her answer to that, you'll need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories show so you can get access to our quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. I just posted the third quarter episode this weekend, and it features book recommendations and some extra conversation with Mark Ulrichsen, Nathaniel Popkin, Hal Mayforth, David Lloyd, Lance Richardson, Glenn David Gold, Moby, Audrey Niffenegger, and Ken Crimstein. You can support the Virtual Memory Show via patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. I've got all sorts of goals and goodies in place for patrons, including that podcast, patron-only blog, handwritten show notes for every episode, my secret project, which I'll get back to, and more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. Now, I recorded this episode at Angela's home on the Upper West Side, so that means like $12 or so at the George Washington, another $30 to park at my favorite garage on West 96th Street. It was an evening session, so no coffee this time around. Now, if you want to help defray some of the costs of the Virtual Memories show, like web hosting, travel, equipment, coffee, or just toss me some money because you think the show is worth it, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. A special thanks go out to Joe Caruso, Michael Hacker, Michael Janizik, Paul Karasik, Fred Kish, Jonathan Kranz, Jack Lescamella, Teresa Lewis, Stephen Nadler, Payne Prophet, Dmitry Samarov, Stephen Solomon, Craig P. Steffen, Greg Tanner, Ford Thomas, Noah Van Skyver, and Garrett Zecker for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories show. We have the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Now, our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist, and you can look up Hal on soundcloud.com as Mayforth, with the number 4 standing in for the FOR. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week, Thanksgiving week, with Kathy B. Graham, an illustrator, painter, and floral designer who has quite a story to tell. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at Facebook.com/Virtual Memories Show, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. That'll help us build a bigger audience. Now, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you are awesome. Keep it that way.